Hello everyone, welcome to the Scroll Ensemble Classical Music Improvisation channel. I'm Robert, and in this previous video you could watch a performance of improvised solo fantasias inspired by Telemann's flute fantasias and Finaroli's Partimenti. In this video I want to talk a bit about my process in developing these improvisations, and maybe that will be helpful to you too. More Partimento and my general research into it can be found here. So I improvised two fantasias. One was based on Finaroli Partimenti and the other based on Fantasia 12 by Telemann. The first fantasia is based on 4 Partimenti by Finaroli. Partimenti are pedagogical, but some of them are so beautiful that they work as concert pieces as well. At a macro level, Telemann's fantasias don't have a typical organizational structure, but rather play with the typical structures of the time, like a suite, concerto or sonata. And then Telemann will make something new out of that. An interesting example is the 7th fantasia, which has a French overture to start, and then unexpectedly a short presto as second and final movement. Telemann wrote 3 fantasias with 4 movements, 5 with 3, and 4 with 2 movements, although some of those are multi-sectional movements. I basically opted for 4 movements to challenge myself to make as many different movements as possible. So this was my plan for the 4 movements. A short, grand introduction, like a grave in an overture, which was inspired by the 2nd Fantasia's grave. A fuguetta, or a small 2-part fugue, inspired by Fantasia 6, but we can also find similar movements in Fantasia 1 and 7. A substantial slow movement after Fantasia 8, and a light, short final movement with a dancey, folky feel, which in my interpretation are used to end as many as 8 Telemann Fantasias. For the first movement, I liked the idea of a grave, reminiscent of the French overture. Naturally, I looked for a partimento that already suggested something in this direction, and this is how I ended up with this little prelude from Finaroli's book 6. As an inspiration for melodic figuration, I chose for this figure from the 2nd Fantasia's Adagio, because there's both the sense of a longer held note in the top voice and rhythmic movement, perhaps even in thirds, in 2 parts in the lower voices. I also liked the idea from the Fantasia 2 grave of the opposition between slower and faster notes in the opening gesture, and similar to this grave, Finaroli's Largo has a few similar opening gestures and then a longer final phrase. These are related to each other, the opening gestures and the final phrase, but there is a different texture in the opening gesture compared to the final phrase. In this case, whilst recording, I started to develop a texture with 2 voices moving in opposite direction for the 2nd bit, which I liked so much that I kept it. So through improvisation, several elements became rather composed and returned in some form, or even literally in every version of this improvisation. I then purposefully left the final bars freer, playing out the texture of previous bars in different ways. The 2nd movement was the biggest challenge for me, as this was my first time experimenting with a proper fugal movement. This has always been a dream of mine. My first inspiration for this were the 3 fuguetta movements in Telemann's flute fantasias, number 1, 6, and 7. By breaking an interval in time, Telemann suggests 2 voices, which we've already seen. But then one of these voices, of course, could be the theme and the other the counter subject. And in this way we can create a sort of faux fugue. Not all themes are workable, as a subject that has too much rhythmic activity already becomes too complex and unclear with any added other parts. Similarly, if the theme has a big range in and of itself, it's difficult to add a counter-subject in a different range of the instrument, let alone transpose it to different keys. Fenaroli's Partimento was likely also meant for two-part fugal treatment, being one of the first exercises in fugue that one meets in his Partimenti. Gerdingen also suggests a two-part execution of the fugal parts, and then that the episodes can be a bit richer, with maybe 3 parts, or for example more chordal sections. And this is actually exactly what Telemann often does. So this made me very happy. This is the perfect Partimento to apply Telemann's ideas to. The theme's range is on the border of doable, so sometimes I had to play very high notes on the recorder to make it work. But still, it just about fit. And then also this huge difference in range somehow made the different parts come out more, I think. As for the rhythmic activity, the subject of the fugue is in half notes, which is perfect for adding the counter subject on the offbeats. As with Telemann's fugues, in these fugues we're dealing with invertible counterpoint. So that means the counter subject can be played below, but also above the theme. This also means that the counter subject is already somewhere in the Partimento, where we then have to add the theme above. So our first task is to find it by realizing where the theme fits over the written bass. The rest of this Partimento bass consists of bits of material of these themes, which means that basically the solution of the entire Partimento is already inside itself. But as Telemann sometimes does, in the episodes we can also take more liberty. This was a very nice aspect of improvising on this Partimento, experimenting each time with different approaches to these in-between sections. An interesting example of this is bar 25, where we find the theme in a sort of sped-up variant. But this could also be realized in a canonic way, imitating this theme variant the bar after, or even in a freer way, ignoring any imitative ideas. So here improvisation consists of knowing all your options and then choosing in the moment which option to go with. The third movement is sort of huge compared to most Telemann's movements. But herein also lies the adventure of doing something in the style, yet a little bit new and your own. This movement consists of a few different sections, and in a way is closer to several of Handel's recorder sonata movements, in that their sequential nature is less clear. Of course, it has some sequences, but overall it has more different ideas, making it more of a continuous movement in which different ideas come together. So I tried to find different figurations, but also tried to ornament repeated materials and figurations in different ways, kind of painting over the sequential smells. In my ornamentation, I was aiming for a Corellian style, which is rather elaborate and has fast rubato-like figurations. But hearing it back now, I realize it's more typically Telemannesque, what I did, which I guess is good, in that it combines the different styles of ornamentation of his time, which was typical for the German mixed style. If you're curious about that, you can find more information about this in my Quantz videos. In the fourth movement, I tried to keep to the adage less is more. Some Partimento basses are almost complete nice melodic pieces in their own right. Interestingly though, I only realized after I had chosen this Partimento that this is actually one of the Diminuiti type, which means that Fenaroli has suggested what type of figuration to use in your improvisation in the right hand. So, then to try to stay true to that nature, I did try to incorporate this triplet idea. Here is though an example of where the second part of Finaroli's idea doesn't work on a single monodic instrument, simply because there's not enough rhythmical space left to add another part. For the second Fantasia, I wanted to do what I usually do with an audience, but take it a step farther, especially in length, coherence and awareness of my modulations. So I improvised a free Fantasia, but this time I took ideas from Fantasia 12 as my starting point. I especially took on the overall form, which has two movements, first a multi-section fantasy movement, and then a sort of Polish-inspired dance, and the form of the opening of the Fantasia. Telemann's 12th Fantasia is to me the closest to the Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach type, especially in the first movement, with different sections, with different characters, which do come back, but are perhaps seemingly disjointed when changing from one idea to the next. A comparison in the time, and in this fascinating book, was made to the English Garden, which had planned but seemingly unexpected turns, with sudden vistas of so-called wild nature. Another fascinating aspect is that this movement, as the only in the entire set of Fantasias, finishes on the relative major, the third degree. Now the next movement just starts in the main tonality again, so it's not like a modulation or like ending on the dominant to prepare for the next movement. It just ends there. My preparation here consisted mostly of what I've learned on my journey so far, but also an analysis of the 12th Fantasia, in order to get into the ideas Telemann used more deeply. My hope was that then these ideas would subconsciously permeate my playing, and I think they did. I especially followed the tonal structure of the beginning. But then in the part where Telemann also becomes a bit freer, which somehow felt to me a bit like the development section, different parts came together, but also some simple rule of the octave lines, I allowed myself to just improvise and let it go. I think it does become a little incoherent, so there's still some work to do there, but overall it was a better attempt than usually. The second movement is typical for Telemann. As I said before, in about 8 Fantasias we find these short, fast, folkish movements. Telemann was famous for bringing the Polish style into the German mixed style, and often there are some organ point type places, there is some kind of folky feel in the figuration, and so I also added a sort of bourdon note at some point, inspired by a text by Mersenne, where he says there's this famous musician who is traveling around. He's imitating the bagpipes, the musettes, by playing 2 recorders or playing a recorder and singing at the same time. So that's where there is this little section which is actually historically inspired. Let me know your thoughts. If you want to listen to the recording, you can click here. Thanks for watching, and if you like our videos, it's great if you subscribe, like, share or join us on Patreon.